How to paint watercolor irises. This has been a major request on my Instagram account from my fellow artists. So today I bring you this watercolor tutorial where we are going to paint these irises, and I'm going to keep it super simple. So we are going to use very few brushes and we are going to play a lot with the wet on wet technique. I'm also going to show you a little trick that you can use if you want to create these fine lines on your petals. So let's start to paint together. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. To paint watercolor irises, I suggest you to use a flat brush. I'm mixing a little bit of yellow ochre and I start to create the first petal that you find in the upper part of this flower. For this whole composition, I want us to play a lot with the wet on wet technique and therefore to start to create these petals from very light color values. This means using colors with not so much pigment in it, but with a lot of water. To create this petal, I am using a flat brush, and in particular the side of this flat brush. And this is the brush that I've used and gave me the most success, compared, for example, even to a round brush that I try to use to create these petals of these irises. And so my recommendation here is to start to create these petals in a sort of a triangular shape where the upper part of the petal is a little bit wider and it comes to a point at the bottom part of this petal. And then creating all the other petals that are connecting to the center part of this flower. In particular, I created this second petal always using a very light mixture of yellow ochre, and now I'm adding a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta to start to allow some color to blend into the first layer. I find this flower beautiful to paint in watercolor because it allows us to play with the wet on wet technique, and therefore at this point I really suggest you to experiment, to use the colors that you like the most and try to allow through different layers, through different moments, to let these colors to blend when the paint is still wet. I'm adding the center yellow, this is some lemon yellow, and I'm allowing also some of this same yellow to blend into the first and the second petal that I've created of this iris, the first main iris. And I want, therefore, this yellow to create a sort of connection between the center part of the flower and also with the petals. To give a little bit of variety to this first iris, I've decided to mix a little bit of Cobalt Violet to create the petal on the left side of this flower. And I'm using the same technique and mainly mixing a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta into this petal and using mainly the side of this brush to allow these colors to blend together. You can use very concentrated brush strokes of pigment to allow colors to blend, or you can play with less concentrated amounts of pigment and you can obtain different effects mixing even more than two colors together. When you are creating these petals, remember to always connect them to the center that in this case we have created in yellow color. And when you create the beard of this iris, so the lower petal of this iris, just keep in mind to have the edges a little bit fragmented. This means not in a straight line. And this comes easy if you use the side of this flat brush. And at this point you can also add some more concentrated, for example, yellow ochre or Quinacridone Magenta or any other color that you prefer to allow different colors to blend. Also, my suggestion when you are creating these lower petals is to keep some areas of these petals that are not completely covered by pigment. As you can notice, the center of this beard is completely white, so it means it's still the page, the white page that I have left untouched by pigment. And this will allow us to create a different effect, and I would say an even looser effect for these petals. Have fun adding as many colors as you want to your petals, and when you are ready, you can start to proceed to create another iris in the lower left part of this page. For this iris, I'm using a mixture of Cobalt Violet with Quinacridone Magenta. And as I have done for the first iris, the very first layer is very light, and it means that there is a very little concentration of Cobalt Violet with a higher concentration, a higher amount of water. And at this point, while the pigment is still wet, I am adding some more concentrated Cobalt Violet into the petals. Also for this petal, I'm not creating a perfect shape, but I'm leaving some white space, some blank paper that allows me to understand anyway, even if there isn't pigment, what's the shape of this petal. And for the beard of this purple iris, I am also leaving the center part of this petal completely empty, and I'm using some wet on wet technique to allow some areas to be darker in color. I am still using a mixture of Cobalt Violet, but I'm also adding a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta to blend into this first layer. And at this point, the fun part starts, because with the back of any brush you're using, you can start to add some fine lines to the petals of these irises. It means that you are just touching the paper with the back of any brush you're using, and you're dragging the wet pigment onto the page. This will leave some fine lines where your brush passes through, and when the painting is going to be completely dry, you will notice that the effect is to have created some veins into the petals of these irises. This is, of course, a sort of tip, and you can use it in any flower composition you're creating, not only on irises, and I find it really beautiful. And I suggest you to try this because it's something unusual and the results can really be beautiful. Also, what I like is that if you try to use this technique in areas where you are not having any pigment but just the white paper, you will see on this white paper these fine lines, and the result is really natural. For this third iris, I've decided to use a mixture instead of some ink. This is some gray ink, and I've created the first petal just using this mixture, and I'm adding a little bit of lemon yellow and yellow ochre to allow some blend effects. The technique I'm using is very similar. I'm mainly using the side of this brush, and I've used this different color now because I will touch with the brush the purple pigment of the second iris, and will allow some beautiful wet on wet happening on the petals, and I like to see the effects of the blending between purple and yellow of these two flowers. If you're finding this video useful and if you like to paint flowers, press like down below, and if you wanted to support me with the creation of other videos in this style, please subscribe to this channel because it really helps me to create some free content for you to watch and also videos for you to learn how to paint loose style flowers. Thank you very much! Also, if you want to improve your technique on how to paint loose style flowers, remember you can download for free the 18-page ebook I wrote. The name is The Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting, where I have highlighted all the techniques and the supplies to have if you're just starting your flower adventure, your watercolor flower adventure, and you would like some support on watercolor flower painting. Download your free ebook by clicking on the link in the description below. I've created this third iris next to the purple iris, and I'm taking advantage of the wet on wet technique to create these beautiful blends on all of the petals. I'm then using the back of this brush to create some fine lines that just come from the movement of the wet paint on the page. You can create these fine lines on all of the petals. I've just created these lines on the upper and the lower petal of these flowers to create just a little bit of movement on some petals and to create a little bit of variety. But of course you can take advantage of this technique and use it as much as you want. Also, I'm creating the center of this third flower in orange color. I'm using some transparent orange, and in particular I'm also allowing some of the orange to blend into the purple color of the lower petal of this flower, because I really like how these two colors blend together. And at this point I noticed that there is some white space in the upper left corner of this page, and therefore I've decided to add just a little bud of iris in the upper part of the page using similar colors. Therefore the first layer is just a light mixture of yellow ochre, and now I'm allowing some more concentrated Quinacridone Magenta and yellow ochre to blend into the first layer. This is just a small bud, and you can either add the same or you can add a bigger flower if you have a little bit more space. And for the stems and the leaves of these irises, I'm keeping everything very loose and quite simple. Leaves are quite easy to paint in the sense that they are sort of straight leaves. They don't have a particular shape. And so I'm using still this flat brush to create this sort of strokes in mainly sap green with a little bit of cobalt violet to create a sort of green that is duller and create a connection between the flowers we have created that contain a lot of cobalt violet and the green parts. I'm allowing also some Azomethine green yellow, which is a brighter green, to blend into the wet green, and I do this because I really like how this brighter and lighter green can really add some light into the painting. Using a flat brush to create these leaves, in my opinion, is really the simplest way. You could also use a round brush, for example, a quite thick round brush, but I think using a round brush, these leaves would become a little bit more precise in their shape and, let's say, less loose. So I recommend you, if you have a flat brush, to really use the same brush to create also these leaves. Remember to play with the color values of your brush strokes, and so to use some brush strokes that are much darker and some brush strokes that are a little bit lighter in order to create, for example, leaves that have different colors, and therefore some will look like being a little bit more in the foreground while others are going to feel like they are more in the background of this painting. And as I am adding a little bit of orange ink to the center of these flowers, we have reached the end of this tutorial. I really hope you had fun. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.